do these type of presentations and for it to reach more people than if we were like having this in a face-to-face location. So thank you for having me here. I'm a little bit nervous. This is my first presentation virtually, so we will see. And I think, Catherine, you're recording, right?
Yes, sorry, okay. I just started recording. I just want to make sure that everybody's okay with that. If you feel uncomfortable with that, send me a quick message or just, do the thumbs up if you're okay with it. Feel free to message me if you're not. Great, thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to start. I'm going to share my screen. Can you all see that? Okay. So I'm going to say similarly to what Catherine said. She did a wonderful job introducing me. And I also want to thank you, Catherine, for inviting me here and to share my knowledge and my passion with you all here. So like Catherine said, I have a master's in social work concentrated in mental health. And let's see. And for the last 6.5 years, I have been working with the Latinx community at El Futuro. That's a local mental health nonprofit organization. Some of you may know who they are. That's where I have gotten a lot of my experience and a lot of my training with working with this community. I also want to quickly say that throughout this presentation, I'm going to be using the words Latinx and Latino or Latina interchangeably. What I have found is that with younger Latinx people, they prefer Latinx, but older generation, a lot of them prefer to go by Latino or Latina. So I want to be respectful of everyone's preferences. But when I say Latinx or Latino, I'm speaking about the same thing. So at El Futuro, I have been working there for 6.5 years. I specialize in the treatment of trauma, anxiety, and depression. El Futuro is an organization that focuses on Latino mental health, but also substance use within the Latino community. And again, I am a first-generation Dominican immigrant, and I was raised in New York City. And I think the reason why I'm sharing that is because our lived experiences impact the way in which we interact with others. So my experiences as a Dominican immigrant growing up in New York City has definitely played a role in who I am today. And so during this presentation, I'm going to invite you all to reflect on how your identity, and this includes the country that you come from, the generation you were raised in, your cultural, religious beliefs, how that impacts you as a person, and then also as a faith leader, and then how that impacts the people that you serve. So going back to the importance of identity and the importance of our roots and how they impact our values, our beliefs, and how we show up in our interactions with others. So right here is just 2 pictures of where I grew up in the Dominican Republic, just my abuelita and my abuelito's house right there, the yellow house. And so my experience was that my parents migrated to the US and had to leave my brother and I with my maternal grandparents for the first 6 years of my life. And so I reunited with my parents when I was 6 years old. And that has definitely shaped who I am. And it also plays a huge role in my work, my profession as a therapist. I bring all of that with me. And so I also want to take a few moments before we jump right into talking about mental health and trauma to engage in a practice that I do with all of my clients. So all of the people that sit with me in my office, the first thing that I teach them is the power of the breath. The breath is something that we have access to all the time. Sometimes we forget that it's there. And I think especially now during COVID-19, where this virus impacts so much the way that a person breathes, I think it's important to remember that it's there. The breath is powerful for many reasons. Usually when we are experiencing anxiety, we might experience shortness of breath. When we are angry, when we are stressed out, it's almost like we're holding on to our breath. We might feel it just here in our chest. Sometimes it might be difficult for people to breathe, particularly if they're experiencing a lot of anxiety or panic. And so what I want to do is just a little practice that I teach everyone. And it's just an invitation to breathe. So this is up to you. You don't have to do this if you don't want to. But what I want you to focus on is just the space that you are in right now. And notice perhaps what you're feeling in your body, what thoughts are coming through your head. If you feel any tension, any stress, any discomfort that's coming up for you. And so just take a deep breath. And when I say deep breath, usually we're always breathing through our chest, but a deep breath comes from our bellies. So it's more like a breathing, and I tell people, imagine that you're smelling a flower. So you take a deep breath, and then you imagine that you're blowing out a candle. And you let it out through your mouth or your nose, whichever one feels more comfortable. Most people, when they start practicing this exercise, they prefer to breathe out through the mouth. So we're gonna do it 2 more times. So take a deep breath and then let it out. Then 1 more time. And out. And as you do that, just notice how you feel. If you feel the same or if you feel a little bit more calm, a little bit more relaxed. I know for me, because I was anxious about doing this, I'm feeling a little bit more calm. So I'm doing this for you all, but also for myself. So I want you to also notice how when I asked or invited you to breathe, it was more of an invitation. This is part of allowing people to have choice. When a person experiences trauma, they have lost power and control. They don't have a lot of choices. So being able to ask people to say, I invite you to, it gives people the permission to do something else if they don't want to do that. So this is part of being trauma aware and being trauma informed. So in all of my interactions with people, I aim to create an environment in which they have choice and power. This helps them to begin to see what they like and don't like in terms of techniques that we're practicing. For me, particularly when working with my clients, the people that I serve, is for them to be able to say to me, oh, I don't like that breathing technique. Can we try something else? And so by doing that with a therapist, it can lead them to feeling empowered to continue to engage in their healing. Okay, so throughout the presentation, make sure, remind yourself to breathe, because it's important. I actually think it's one of the greatest tools that God gave us, because it's always there. Okay, so today we are specifically talking about trauma, but I think that we can't talk about trauma without talking about mental health. Mental health is something that we are all impacted by. It covers our emotional, psychological, behavioral, and social well-being. And it also impacts our physical health. because what affects the mind also has an effect on the body, as our mind and our body are connected to each other. So the World Health Organization states that mental health is not just the absence of mental illness, which I'm going to talk about in a few slides from now. It also involves a state of well-being in which people are able to cope with the normal stresses they face in daily life. Mental health allows people to recognize their own abilities, to work productively, and to make meaningful contributions to their communities. So knowing this information, knowing what mental health is something that we all have, just how we all have physical health. Knowing that, why do you think mental health matters? So that's just to reflect on, why is mental health important? And so now we're going to talk about mental illness and the different ways in which it impacts us. So the National Alliance on Mental Illness states that mental illness is a condition that affects a person's thinking, feeling, behavior, or mood. These conditions deeply impact day-to-day living and may also affect the ability to relate to others. It doesn't just impact an individual, it impacts the family system that the person comes from, their social environments, their occupation, and their community. And we can see this in the way that homelessness impacts a community. The majority of people that are homeless have some sort of mental illness. And so it's not just an individual issue or just something that we should only put responsibility on the person or the family experiencing mental illness. It's something that impacts our entire society. And now here we can see why does Latinx mental health matter? So if you look at this here, this is information, I believe this is from 2018. And in the US population, about 18% of the US population are Latinx or Hispanic. Of that percentage, 15% had a diagnosable mental illness in the past year. So I think this is from 2018. I actually suspect that the percentage of Latinos with mental illness will continue to rise, especially now with COVID-19, as our community is being significantly impacted by the pandemic. And according to research, Latinx people are also more likely than others to be concerned about the coronavirus threat to their health, to their finances, and their livelihoods. A lot of times, because they don't have the type of work that they can just work from home, it puts them at higher risk to get the virus, but then it also impacts their financial situation if they cannot work from home. And I like this graph here because this shows us, it's a little bit more detailed on what impacts the Latino community. So when we think about the Latinx community and substance use and mental illness, you can see here the different numbers, right? So about 3.1 million had a substance use. This is people that are 18 years and older. And about 6.9 million 18 years old and above had some sort of mental illness. And when I speak about mental illness, I'm speaking about things like depression, anxiety. Sometimes it can be psychosis, it can be trauma-related illnesses. And it doesn't mean that the person is going to have that for the rest of their life. It just means that for the time being, they're struggling and they might need help. With substance use, although I'm not a substance use counselor, we do have substance use treatment at El Futuro. I don't really work with individuals with substance use, but it does show up with some of my clients. And usually what's at the core of substance use is also trauma. And so substance use is just, it's basically used to cope with the trauma or with the depression, with the emotions that a person might have had to keep to themselves. And so substance use at the core is trauma, and we have to treat it as a trauma-related condition. And so also there are people that have, in this graph it says some people that have both. I think that the numbers should probably be a little bit higher, but we'll go with that. Okay. So if we go with the numbers of 16% of Latinos having a mental illness, that's 2 out of 9. So you can just imagine 2 out of 9 people in your church are suffering from some sort of mental illness. And often they're suffering in silence. Oftentimes there's a lot of shame related to mental illness. And so they suffer in silence. So 2 out of 9 is actually a lot of people. And when we look back to 2018, 56.8% of Latinx young adults between the ages of 18 to 25 and 39.6% of adults between the ages of 26 to 49 did not receive treatments for their mental illness. This doesn't mean that the mental illness will just disappear. It just means that they're managing it on their own, or they're having all of these symptoms, and again, they're suffering in silence for many different reasons. At El Futuro, the diagnoses that we encounter the most are depression, anxiety, substance use, and trauma-related disorders. So when we think about the issues that people come with in the Latino community, oftentimes it's domestic violence or community violence in their home country. So if they have migrated to the United States, oftentimes it's because there's a lot of community violence and they're trying to escape from that. We see a lot of sexual trauma or childhood sexual trauma involving incest within families. We see migration trauma, because migrating to the US is a traumatic experience in itself. We see a lot of racism and discrimination, poverty and lack of resources and supports, and also family conflict related to cultural differences and beliefs. This happens often in teenagers and their families. So if there's a teenager, I primarily work with teenagers and young adults. Usually what I see in teenagers that have been raised in the US and their parents were raised in another country, what happens is that there's a big disconnection in cultural beliefs. So these teenagers, these children grow up to be teenagers that have been raised between two cultures. So you have their country of origin. So I'll use me for an example. I was born in the Dominican Republic, but I was raised here. And so when you are growing up between two cultures that are very different, you have our culture, Latino culture, which is very collective. We take care of each other. And then in American culture, which tends to be more individualistic. So you have a person, a child, growing up between two cultures, and it creates a lot of conflict between their parents and themselves. And so There's also family conflict related to adjusting to the family system in situations where the child was left behind in their home country and the parents came first and then they reunited years later. That child and that parent don't really know each other. And so that also creates a lot of conflict. It creates a lot of parents. Usually what I hear from parents is that their child or their teenager está siendo muy malcriado, right? Or they're not listening. They had these expectations. They want them to be grateful for all of their sacrifices. And yes, all of that is true. All of that is important. And also this child doesn't really know the family. And oftentimes what happens as well is that they reunite with a family where now they have siblings that were born here and that have been with their parents all of this time. So sometimes there's jealousy. I see this often in mothers and daughters. I have a special interest. I specialize in working with family dynamics and mother-daughter relationships. And this shows up a lot between mothers and daughters. Oftentimes, I think it's influenced by the fact that either the father is working often, so a lot of the time the teenager is spending with the mom. And so the friction happens with the mom. Okay. So I'm going to check in with you all and just remind you to breathe, because right now we're going to talk about trauma, which is something I'm really passionate about. And I'm excited to share with you. Let me drink some water. I'm not used to talking this much. So, trauma is an individual experience. What is traumatic for one person may not necessarily be traumatic for another person. Individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or sets of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. And it tends to have lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning, their mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. One of my favorite person that studies trauma is Peter Levine. And he says that trauma is not what happens to us, but what we hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. So what this means is that trauma is not necessarily the event. Trauma is the meaning that we assign to what happened. And it's also related to perhaps the shame that we experience when there is trauma. It's this idea of you're not being strong, you have to be strong. It's not having someone listening, not having a support system. So trauma can be very lonely. When a person suffers from it, in many cases, they're suffering alone. And then trauma does not discriminate. It can affect anyone, regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, gender, age, socioeconomic status, or sexual orientation. Usually when people think of trauma, they think of things like big traumas, like domestic violence, witnessing a natural disaster, sexual trauma, physical trauma, migration experiences, and so much more. But trauma is also things like being left behind, even though it was for a good reason, right? When parents migrate, they do it for good reasons. But that in itself is a trauma for that child that has been left behind because they're no longer with their parents. So again, I'm going to remind you that trauma is about how the individual labels and assigns meaning to the events or the events. It can be various events happening at the same time. And they will be disruptive physically and psychologically. Trauma is also felt in the body. It's not just something that we process with our mind. It also impacts how we feel in our bodies. Okay. So more about trauma. It is events or experiences that completely overwhelm a person's ability to cope or integrate the ideas and the emotions involved in those experiences. It has a lasting impact on the nervous system. This is why in the beginning of this presentation, I invited you all to just check in with yourself, to check in with where you're having tension in your body. Part of what happens in trauma is that people disconnect from their bodies. And so they don't pick up on the signs that their body is giving them. And because it impacts our nervous system in such a way, it makes us perhaps more hypervigilant. It makes us lose trust in ourselves and our ability to keep ourselves safe. So regardless of what the trauma is, regardless of what the experience is, there are 3 common elements that happens in trauma. And that is, it's unexpected, the person was not prepared for it, and there was absolutely nothing that the person could do to stop it from happening. So we can say that this COVID-19 is a traumatic experience. It's a collective traumatic experience because it was unexpected. We, in the beginning especially, we were unprepared, and there's nothing we can do right now. There's some stuff we can do, but there's not really anything we can do that will stop this threat. And so that, for a lot of people, it turns into added trauma. So simply put, traumatic events are beyond a person's control. The person has lost power and control. The person has no choice in what's happening. They just have to react. And again, it is not the event that determines whether something is traumatic to someone, but it's the individual's experience of that event, the meaning that they make of it, and the response that they get from their community. This is really interesting because this is often witnessed in like families where there are siblings, and one sibling might remember a specific event as traumatic, but the other sibling might not. And just because the other sibling does not remember it as traumatic does not invalidate that sibling's response to it, because for them it was traumatic. So even if it does not cause physical damage, it still takes a serious emotional toll on the person that is experiencing it. And so this continues to have a profound impact on the person's identity, right? I keep talking about identity, and I also keep talking about when we experience trauma, because part of being trauma informed is assuming that we have all experienced trauma. So yeah, people that experience trauma when it's an isolated event or when they don't have anyone to share, they feel lonely, they feel scared, they feel ashamed. There's a lot of shame that is also underneath trauma. So having someone that is not going to reject them or invalidate them will actually help them process the traumatic events and lead them to healing. And so what that looks like is, if someone is sharing something that was traumatic for them, it's being able to hold space for them And instead of saying something like, oh, it couldn't have been that bad, you're overreacting, which is what happens often in families. It's being able to sit with them and listen to the person and to just hear them. Because what happens often is that when we try to listen to people, I will use myself. I feel like I am a much better listener as a therapist than I am to my family. And so the reason for that is that with our families, with our friends, we have more of an emotional involvement, more of an emotional investment in them. And so oftentimes we just want to fix things for them instead of holding the trauma with them. Sometimes people don't know how to respond when a person is sharing deep emotional experiences because it feels uncomfortable to sit with that, right? And so sometimes we offer feedback or advice that might not be what the person needs. The reason why we tend to offer that feedback is because it makes us feel comfortable. It makes us feel like we did something for that person. But what people really need is to just be held and and when I say to be held, is to just have that moment sharing this experience and being listened to, having validation. Okay. So I'm going to go a little bit deeper into the different ways that trauma impacts the different parts of a person. So I'm trained in social work, and in grad school, they train us to, and I think this is not just in social work. So therapists, there's many different types of therapists. So you have social workers, like licensed clinical social workers. You have licensed mental health professionals. You have marriage and family therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists. We all get similar training, but there are specialized trainings for each. So like a marriage and family therapist, a lot of their training is in marriage and family, like relationships. But one of the things that we all have that's similar is to meet the clients exactly where they are. So this goes back to being able to hold space for a person and just be there with them without wanting to change it for them, which is really uncomfortable, because when usually as humans, when we see someone in pain, we want to fix that for them. We want to offer our help. So when we meet a person where they are at, this involves all parts of themselves. It's the emotional, the physical, the mental and intellectual, the social, and the spiritual. So as therapists, we are trained to utilize all of these aspects. There's more aspects as well, such as occupational, like a person's employment and all those things, because all of those things have some sort of impact in a person's life. What we see with trauma is that it changes the brain structures of a person. When they do I think MRIs, when they have done research studies where I've seen this done with veterans, military veterans, where they will study a veteran's brain, and then they will study a brain of someone that has not experienced trauma. And you can actually see different parts of the brain are activated in a person with trauma. It's the same thing with people with depression. Different parts of their brain are also activated. So it changes brain structure. The good thing about the brain is that while trauma and depression and things like that change it, there's also something called neuroplasticity And what that means is that our brain, with the right tools, we can change. Like we have in our, I don't want to get too clinical, but in our brain, we have like neurons, they make connections. So when you have a traumatic experience, there's communication going on in your brain. And based on that traumatic experience, you create you make meaning to it. You create a perspective of it. And that keeps the person in a traumatic state. And so with neuroplasticity, what happens is that with therapy and the right tools, that actually shifts and the person can make changes. And you can actually also see the effects of that when they do brain scans. So things like hypervigilance, which is when a person is almost like always on alert and looking at their surroundings when they don't feel safe in their surroundings, that is just a way of our brain trying to keep us safe. So if you have an experience where you felt like your life was in danger, you were outside and you felt like your life was in danger, it is likely that next time you go outside, your brain is going to be looking for signs of danger as a way to protect you. This is just a way of coping. There's nothing wrong with it. Then physical impact. Often trauma happens first to the body. This happens often in physical and sexual trauma. It first happens in a person's body, and then the person makes meaning of it. And so the physical impact of trauma and also of things like depression and anxiety, there are physical impacts to that too. But with trauma, it's hypervigilance, racing heart, shallow breathing. With depression is a lack of energy, not wanting to get up. It's not that a person is being lazy. It's just that the person can't get up. It might look like headaches. In anxiety, it also looks like a lot of rapid heart beating. It might look like panic attacks that lead a person to go to the hospital because they think that they're having a heart attack, but usually it might just be a panic attack. So the trauma, the mental illness also lives in our bodies. And this again is why the first thing I teach my clients is to breathe and to be able to calm themselves so that whenever they do experience a trigger to their trauma, they can return to the breath. When they're having difficulty sleeping because they're having nightmares and they wake up from that nightmare, they can take deep breaths and calm themselves. Emotional impact of trauma, feeling sad, irritable. Oftentimes, if a person has trauma, they're also having nightmares. And so if a person's having nightmares, they're not really sleeping well. And if they're not sleeping well, it's going to impact their mood. They might be emotionally disconnected from themselves, but also from others. On a spiritual impact, what I have seen often is that the person will question their faith. They will feel a lack of trust for God or the higher power they believe in. In my work with Latinos, the way that I have seen this play out is often a lot of blame, a lot of thoughts that they must have done something to deserve this, and a lot of questioning God's role in their life. And why will God do this to me when I'm a good person? It's usually the one of the first things that I hear people say. So you can imagine that when a person shows up with that, a lot of the work that I have to do as a therapist is to help them unpack all of that and to help them, if it's important for them, if their spiritual life is important for them, to help them deconstruct or take apart these thoughts that tell them that they have these experiences because they did something bad or they deserved it or God doesn't love them. And then on a social impact, they might feel disconnected from their loved ones. They might have a lack of trust in their loved ones. They might perceive the world as dangerous. This also shows up in employment. They might call out of work a lot because they're just not doing well, they're not feeling well. And so again, I'm going to stress the importance of recognizing that this is not a person being lazy. This is not a person trying to victimize themselves. It's just the impact, like the heaviness that they're carrying impacts their entire life. And so they just show up and do as best as they can with, you know, which might look different for everyone. So yeah. Now I want to talk about the different types of trauma. And the sun is in my face. I apologize about that. See if I can move. So the different types of trauma that I have gathered here today, this is just going to be a brief information. These are just things that I think it's important for people to be aware of. So historical trauma is multi-generational trauma that has been experienced by a racial, ethnic, cultural group. Oppression usually plays a role in this. So we can see this in the Holocaust, slavery, forced migrations, and the colonization of Native Americans. It's actually really interesting that they have done research on the like family members, grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. And even though what they have found is that even though the grandchildren did not experience the Holocaust, they have some of the physical responses to trauma as if they were in the Holocaust. It's almost like the trauma gets passed down and it just goes and moves from generation to generation. Then we have intergenerational trauma, which is unresolved internalized trauma that is passed down in each generation. This is one that I'm particularly interested in because I see this all the time. I see unresolved trauma in previous generations get passed down. So an example that I can think of is in a family system where there has been sexual trauma. This is not always the case, but this is something that I've seen often. In a family system where there has been sexual trauma, it is likely that like the daughter will also experience sexual trauma. And then when we talk about it more deeply and we try to make sense of the family system, we realize that the mom has also experienced it, or the grandmother. Similarly to domestic violence, it might just be passed on from generation to generation. And so one of my favorite quotes about intergenerational trauma is that pain travels through families until someone is ready to feel it. So I'm going to say that again, because every time I think of that, I think of how the people that I work for, by them showing up and having the courage to see a therapist and to process whatever's going on for them, they are undoing a lot of generational trauma. So pain travels through families until someone is ready to feel it. And then collective trauma is a traumatic event experienced by a group of people or society, such as the events of September 11th and the current COVID-19 pandemic. This is an experience that we are going through, not just in this country, but worldwide. And this will have lasting impacts later on a person, on just our society in general. And then we have physical trauma, which we know as physical violence towards another person, including domestic violence and community violence. and also verbal and emotional trauma, which is the use of verbal abuse, name calling, and bullying. I'm actually going to speak a little more about verbal and emotional trauma in a few slides from now, because I think it's really important to consider this. It might feel like it doesn't have as big of an impact, but it actually does. Okay, so this is where I get a little clinical to kind of just describe the different diagnoses of trauma. So as a mental health professional, we get trained in this book. This is basically a book filled with all the diagnoses of mental disorders and all of the different criteria. And so this is what we reference when we are talking to a person, like with a client, and we're listening to the symptoms that they're having to give them the appropriate diagnosis, so that then their diagnosis matches the treatment plan that we will have with them. So post-traumatic stress disorder, usually with trauma and stressor-related disorder, there has to be, the person has had to witness an event, like a traumatic event, experience the event, or even learning about a traumatic event can lead a person to develop symptoms. So usually individuals that do work with the community, and the community is experiencing trauma, and if you're continuously listening and holding space for people and listening to their traumas, that might turn into secondary trauma for the person that's listening. It's something that we see in mental health professionals. We do experience secondary trauma responses. For myself, in the past, I have experienced not feeling safe after perhaps listening to people talk about community violence, so not feeling safe. And so what we do as professionals is that we have supervision, peer consultation, and also we are encouraged to have our own therapists so that we're getting the support. I imagine that this is similar with also as a faith leader, holding space for people and listening to the different experiences people are having, sometimes maybe feeling helpless, not knowing how to help a person, not knowing what resources are out there, perhaps being frustrated with the lack of resources, especially for our Latinx community. And so secondary trauma is real. Burnout is real. Compassion fatigue is also real. Compassion fatigue happens when we listen to so much of the same stories, so much of the same suffering, that it no longer has the same emotional impact in us. It's almost like, oh, okay, here's another story. And we disconnect as a way to protect. It's a way to self-preserve ourselves. There's nothing wrong with that. It's going to happen as mental health therapists. And not just as mental health therapists, I think this happens in many professions where we are providing a service to people. So post-traumatic stress disorder is what develops after a person has witnessed or experienced or has heard a traumatic experience. Some of the symptoms, these are not all, these are just some of the symptoms that present as the most disturbing for people, include intrusive memories of the event, nightmares, flashbacks. Flashbacks are when people, it's almost like they can be sitting with you, but in their mind, something is triggered and they feel like they are back in the place that created the traumatic experience. Avoidance, so avoidance of thoughts, feelings, people, places. Negative alterations in their cognitions or their mood. So that looks like having like saying, I don't trust the world is not safe anymore. Irritability and hypervigilance. And so usually when a person is diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, one of the first things, well, before we diagnose them, what we ask is, how long have you had these symptoms for? Because then that will let us know if it's post-traumatic stress or if it's acute stress. So acute stress, it's very similar to PTSD, but the symptoms typically begin immediately after the trauma and usually last maybe 3 days to a month. With post-traumatic stress, the symptoms also begin immediately, but they last longer than a month. So I've had situations where like a person comes in maybe 2 weeks after they experience a traumatic event. So I will initially give them a diagnosis of acute stress disorder because they don't meet the duration criteria. And then once it has been a month and they're still having those symptoms, then we change it to PTS, or post-traumatic stress. Then we have adjustment disorder, which is more of a stressor-related disorder. And this occurs when a person develops emotional or behavioral symptoms in response to an identifiable stressor. Usually that stress has to happen within 3 months of the onset of the stressor. So what that means is that, I'll use an example that I've seen lately with COVID, is children having to spend, I think the last 2 or 3 months of the school year at home. That is the stressor. Their life completely changed. And so the way that that manifests itself, not with everyone, but the way that it can manifest itself is with children misbehaving, or, you know, people think, you know, this child is misbehaving when really the child is responding to the stress and to the change. So they're adjusting to this thing that has just happened in their lives and has completely changed the world as they know it. And so with adjustment disorders, we can also put it as adjustment disorder with depressed mood, or adjustment disorder with anxiety, or a combination of the two, where the person is responding to the stressor, but they're also having symptoms of depression and anxiety, perhaps not all of the symptoms of depression and anxiety. We can also put it as adjustment disorder with disturbance of conduct. That is when there is aggressive behavior as a result of the stressor that has happened. And we can also put it as adjustment disorder unspecified. This is usually a diagnosis that we use when there are symptoms, but they don't meet criteria for any of these. So we'll just put adjustment disorder unspecified, and the adjustment disorder will basically cover that this person is responding emotionally and behaviorally to a stressor. So trauma is important because when a person has trauma, it is often associated with suicidal thoughts or suicide attempts. This, again, does not mean that every person with trauma has suicidal thoughts. It just means that they are at higher risk. I did not put it on here, but another thing is self-harming behaviors. So when a person engages in acts like cutting themselves or hitting themselves, this is not a person. What I usually see parents think is that this is and I see this often in teenagers, Latina teenagers actually have the highest percentage of self-harming behaviors. So when they've done research, they have found that Latinas are at the top, and then it's Black teenagers, I think, then Asian, and then white teenagers. And so there's many reasons for that as to why Latinas are at the top. But when they engage in self-harming behavior, again, it's not that they're trying to harm themselves. It's just a way of coping. Similarly to using substances, it's a way of coping with something that has happened. It's usually what I tell the teenagers I work with is that it's an unhealthy coping skill. And so part of the work that we do is helping them develop healthier coping skills. So as you can see, there's many impacts of trauma on community and our society. The effects of trauma places a heavy burden on individuals, families, and communities. And it creates a challenge for public institutions and also for service systems. Oftentimes what happens is that mental health organizations they receive a lot of referrals, a lot of individuals that are experiencing trauma, that are experiencing mental illnesses, and so it overwhelms the system. The good news is that research has also shown that with appropriate supports and intervention, people can actually overcome traumatic experiences. And again, this goes back to just because someone has a diagnosis or a mental illness, it does not mean that they're going to have that for the rest of their lives. What happens is that most people don't receive that. There's a lot of stigma to mental health, not just in the Latino community, but just in general in our society. And so again, people suffer in silence. Okay, so when we speak about emotional abuse and emotional invalidation, I want to shine a light on this topic because it's one that requires a lot of awareness. And it's actually one that shows up in almost all of my sessions, whether the client recognizes it or not. Oftentimes they don't label it as emotional abuse or emotional invalidation. It's usually through therapy that they're able to see that what they experienced was emotional abuse. So emotional abuse is a way to control another person by using emotions to criticize, embarrass, shame, blame, or otherwise manipulate another person. In general, a relationship is emotionally abusive when there is a consistent pattern of abusive words and bullying behaviors that wear down a person's self-esteem and undermine their mental health. When we think of domestic violence, or interpersonal violence between couples, emotional abuse also plays a huge role. The emotional abuse is often what keeps people from leaving these environments, that and financial reasons as well. But with emotional abuse, a person's self-esteem is basically brought like all the way down, and so they don't think that they deserve anything better. They think that that's what their life should be. They think that this is what they deserve. And emotional invalidation is when a person's emotions are ignored, judged, rejected, labeled as unreasonable, invalid, or irrational. One of my favorite quotes that I read when I was like in my mid-20s was, "The way we speak to our children becomes their inner voice." So this is the importance of how language matters. Emotional invalidation happens significantly in the Latino community. And so some of that includes, dejas de llorar o te voy a dar un motivo por cual llorar, right? Stop crying or I'm going to give you a reason to cry about. It also looks like, oh, it wasn't that bad. It wasn't that big of a deal. You're fine. It looks like los hombres no lloran, or men don't cry. So since they're very young, little boys are taught that they cannot have emotions, or that they cannot have emotions that lead them to crying. While I have not worked with a lot of men at my time at El Futuro, I tend to, well, one, a lot of men don't seek mental health treatment. And usually when they do is because there might be some substance use going on. So they usually get treated, or they see one of our substance use counselors. But the work that I have done with the few men that I've worked with, this idea of los hombres no lloran, men don't cry, what it teaches them is that they have to keep all of those emotions to themselves. And then the way that it manifests itself is in anger. The only emotion men can feel is anger. And then it also manifests in substance use, and oftentimes violence, domestic violence, aggressive behaviors. So when you train a child from the very moment that they're very young to not cry, to shove all of their emotions inside of themselves, that becomes their inner voice. They start to emotionally invalidate themselves. So it's almost like if the parent is not speaking beauty into them, right? I think that it's so important to speak goodness and beauty into our children, so that they believe that about themselves, so that they can speak that into themselves, right? So that they can grow and thrive. In homes where that's not happening, that child will grow up to be a teenager and an adult who beats themselves up emotionally and verbally. And so that's just a topic, again, that I think it's so important to keep in mind. It's not to shame anyone. I think it's part of our cultura to want to teach our children to be strong and to not feel things, or to forget things. That's another of the emotionally invalidating comments that people hear often, which is, oh, just olvídate de eso. That happened so long ago, just forget about it. Why are you still affected by this? And so what that does is that it tells that person what you're feeling is wrong. You need to get over it. But just because we tell someone to stop thinking about something does not mean that they're going to stop thinking about it, or that the pain that they experience is going to go away. Just like if I tell you right now, don't think of the color red, you're going to think of the color red. Okay. So the treatments for trauma, there's many treatments for trauma. There's also many treatments for other mental illnesses. But I'm going to talk about the few that most people are trained in. So cognitive-based therapy focuses on the impact of a person's thoughts of an event on their behaviors and their symptoms. So how a person thinks of the traumatic event influences how they feel about it. So in cognitive behavior therapy, usually what we do is we teach people the difference between helpful thinking patterns and unhelpful thinking patterns. And then we help them make those connections, and we encourage them that whenever they're having an unhelpful thinking pattern, to call themselves out and to change it to something that will actually be helpful for them. So this goes back to the language or the way that we speak to our children becomes their inner language. If a child is constantly being told that they're dumb, or another one that I hear often is no sirves para nada, you're not good for anything, right? So if a child hears that consistently throughout their lives, whenever they're trying to do something, they're always going to have that in the background. I'm going to mess this up. I can't do this right. I can't do anything right. So with cognitive-based therapies, what we do is that we help to shift that. Somatic-based therapy focuses on the connection between body and mind to heal trauma. And this includes things like trauma-sensitive yoga, which is something different than like the yoga that people are aware of. It includes breathing techniques, which, like what I taught you all earlier today, it's something that you can teach that to anyone in your lives, and it's just a gift that they'll be able to manage their emotions when they're experiencing any stress or anxiety. And tapping is basically where we teach people to tap on themselves. So it looks like this. This is called the butterfly hug. This is also calming for people. It looks like tapping on your legs, just going like this with your hands on your legs. What this does is that it brings the person back to the present moment, and it gets them out of whatever it is that's happening in their mind, and they kind of just come back. So I use these techniques often when a person is sharing something really painful and they're crying and they can't, it's almost like they can't breathe because they're crying so much. Usually I pause them and we engage in one of these techniques. There's expressive arts therapy. This uses creative expression such as art, dance, music, play, poetry, or bibliotherapy, which is basically just using books to help people process things. This can include the Bible for people to get comfort from the Bible. Creative expression is really good. What I have found is that if a person is having a hard time opening up about something going on in their lives, one, I never force them to share what they're not ready to share. But two, if I put like coloring books in front of them and crayons and colored pencils, they start to color, and as they're coloring, they start to process things, right? Because it's not the eye contact. Like therapy can be very personal because it's a lot of eye contact. And so when they're coloring, the brain is able to process better and share what they're thinking. Eye movement desensitization reprocessing, or EMDR, utilizes bilateral stimulation, which is usually like eye movements, to process unresolved memories from traumatic experiences. This is one that I'm trained in, and there's not a lot of understanding of exactly how it works, but there's lots of research that it works. Usually the way that I do that is I will have like my fingers here, and as the person is processing a traumatic event, they will just follow my fingers with their eyes. What they have found is that it mimics REM sleep, and the brain just starts to heal on its own. The person starts to make connections to the traumatic experience, and they themselves start healing it on their own. EMDR is good because it does not require for the person to share everything that they have experienced. My style is actually to mix all of these, because some people might not be ready for somatic therapy. Some people might not need cognitive therapies. And so I tend to just mix all of them and find what works for the person. And so I'm going to invite you all again. So let's take a couple of minutes to just take 3 deep breaths. Just do it at your pace and just notice what you feel. And notice if it helps to ease any stress that you might be feeling. Breathing exercises also help to stop the many thoughts that we can sometimes have. I tell clients that our thoughts are almost like clouds passing by or ocean waves. Sometimes these thoughts come and they like knock us over, like waves that knock us over. And sometimes they're calm and beautiful. Okay, I'm gonna talk about barriers and then we're gonna take a little break. So barriers to treatment in the Latinx community. I will start with the stigma of yo no estoy loco, right? I'm not crazy. There's this idea in our society in general, not just in the Latino community, that if you're seeing a therapist or if you're seeing a psychiatrist, that means that you are crazy. And that's not true at all. Or this idea that what happens in la casa stays at home, right? So, especially among older people, there's this idea that discussing problems with mental health can create an embarrassment and shame for the family. And so that leads people to not seek treatment. So part of what we do as therapists is we help people unpack these beliefs, these cultural beliefs, these beliefs in our society, and we help them unpack. We don't try to change their mind about it. We just work with it. One of the examples that I like to give my clients when they're struggling with this is that usually when you have a physical illness going on, you go and see your doctor, right? If you're able to, right? So it's the same thing with mental health. There's a lot of language barriers, which make it difficult sometimes for people to communicate with their providers, particularly if they're sharing something very sensitive and the provider does not fully know Spanish. That interferes with the relationship. It interferes with the person's ability to share. And also language is important. This is why at El Futuro, all of the therapists, we all speak Spanish. Because people tend to remember experiences in the language in which it happened. So the brain tends to associate different experiences with the language. So in my case, I spent the first 6 years of my life speaking Spanish. There are experiences and memories that I have that when I think about them, I can only think about them in Spanish. I can think about them in English, but it's almost like if I speak about these memories, I'll switch to speaking in Spanish. And this happens all the time with my clients. I use a lot of Spanglish because they'll just change. They'll just go back and forth based on how old the memory is and what language they remember, they associated the memory with. So this is actually just something called language dependent memory. So another barrier is a lack of health insurance. In 2018, 19% of Hispanic people had no form of health insurance. And in addition to that, there's a limited pool of providers due to language barriers. So they have less options when they don't have insurance. They have less options to seek help. It can be frustrating to try to find a provider that speaks your language. Another barrier is legal status. So for a lot of immigrants that don't have documentation, they have this fear that they will be deported, or that if people find out, like they have this, a lot of times what I hear is that they think that because we're taking down their information, now the government's gonna have that information. And that's not true. Therapy is confidential. We do not share that information with anyone unless the client gives us permission to share it with, usually it's things like with their lawyers or with their doctors. So yeah, even though millions of children of undocumented immigrants are eligible for health insurance under the Affordable Care Act, many families may be afraid to register due to fear of deportation. So that fear is really strong, and it also holds them back from seeking the help that they need. So I'm going to give us a little break, maybe like a 5-minute break, but I'm going to leave you with this question. What other potential barriers have you witnessed or can think about that prevent Latinos from seeking mental health treatment? So just think about that as you go on your break, get yourself some water, do whatever you need to do. And we will be back in 5 minutes, which I think is, what time is it? I don't know what time it is.
6:27, so around 6:32, around 6:35.
Okay, that works.
Okay, let's do that.
Okay, is that good?
That's good.
Okay. So I also want to talk about what exactly is therapy and what it looks like. So usually in therapy, we are building a relationship with the person that we are working with, and it does take time. as it requires trust for trust to be built. Just because I'm a therapist does not mean that a person should automatically trust me, right? There's a power and control in a lot of the roles that we play. I would say even as faith leaders, there's power and control where we have to be aware of that. So it does take time for people to trust a therapist. And so therapy is a space in which a person can show up as they are, and the therapist will listen attentively while also picking up on the body language, facial expressions, and tone of voice in which the person is processing or sharing their thoughts, their emotions, and their lived experiences. It's more than what the person is saying, it's also what they're not saying, what they're not verbally saying, but what they're expressing through their body language and their tone of voice. Therapists provide a space without judgment. Our role is to guide the person to their healing through active listening, open-ended questions, and reflections while providing resources the clients may need. It's holding space while inviting all parts of a person to show up. It is a space where people usually share the experiences they've kept silent due to how painful the experiences are, or fear of being shamed and rejected. Let's see. So this goes back to the importance of holding space for people, which is something that I'm really passionate about, like being able to do that in a way that they feel supported. So research shows that presence of a non-judgmental witness, so in this case, a therapist, willing to hold the emotions of a person also helps to resolve trauma. So I spoke about the different treatment modalities, but what research shows is that while the treatment modalities work, what works the most is the relationship between the therapist and the client, because it has to be based on trust. So because trauma is also something that happens relationally, if a person is harmed by another human, then their trust for humans is impaired in one way or another. So we can work with that in therapy by creating a safety, trusting environments for them. So Peter Levine again states that what makes a great therapist is their presence, their ability to remain centered, their ability to connect with the client's inner world, their nervous system to our nervous system. Let difficult feelings and sensations move through you as a therapist, showing your clients how to feel their feelings and then let them go. So this is why as therapists, we have to do our own work so that it can resonate emotionally for our clients. So if I show up to a therapy session and I'm anxious, what happens is that the nervous system of the other person will pick up on that. Similarly to if you walk into a room where there's tension or there was an argument, your nervous system, your body will pick up on that when you walk into that room. And now this is where you all come in, right? We need you all to collaborate. We all do different things, but very similarly. And so because religion can be a protective factor for mental health in the Latino communities through like faith and prayer and their church events, it can also contribute to the stigma against mental illness and treatment. So some of the things that I have heard is that people think that because they have a mental illness, they have been told that they have demons inside of them, that there's a lack of faith, that they're having these symptoms because of simple behaviors, that they're not praying enough. So targeting religious institutions to help encourage good mental health and treatment seeking is really important. So it's like you play a really big role in this, in their willingness to seek help. And it's what happens is that a person will more willingly trust their faith leader, their pastor, than they will trust a therapist or a doctor or anyone else. So what you share with a person as I'm making the assumption that all of you have some sort of role as faith leaders, your own cultural beliefs, right? Going back to the beginning, plays a role in how you show up and how you interact with people. And that might have an impact on their mental health because they trust you. So consider the ways in which you can use your role to encourage individuals to participate in their faith community and also see a mental health professional if needed. I'm not saying that everyone needs to go to therapy, but it's important to have both if the person does have a mental illness. So therapy and faith can coexist. These are some of the reasons that I have heard as to why people have not looked for a therapist, or why it took them so long to find a therapist. There's a lot of fear that their faith community will say they have weak faith or not praying enough. There's fear of their faith community finding out that they see a therapist. That also goes back to the cultural belief that if you see a therapist, it's because you're crazy, and that's not true. Fear of judgments from their faith community. Fear that mental health professionals are anti-religion, which is also not true, because before we are therapists, we're humans. So I like to tell people I'm a human first, and then all of the other roles follow after that. Of course, there are therapists that don't believe in God or a higher spiritual power, but you will find that in any profession. There's a fear of being told the opposite of what their faith tells them. There's also a fear of being seen as a failure. So this is my personal belief. I believe that me being a mental health therapist is the purpose that God put in me. I think that God created mental health professionals to walk alongside people seeking help, and that therapy and faith both serve their own unique purposes. So I actually consulted with two of my dear friends who are therapists and also pastors. So one of them, his name is Ivan Gonzalez. And then my other friend, Karan Johnson, she's completed her master's in divinity. And I just asked them, what do you think are some things that I should mention in this presentation? And Karan told me that, I thought this was beautiful, that therapists and faith leaders are two wings on the same bird, helping people soar. We play different purposes, but the purpose is to help them move forward. And so myself in particular, I'm not a faith-based therapist, so I will never try to do like spiritual guidance for a person, because that's what pastors do. That's out of my scope of practice. What I will do, however, because a person is made up of spiritual as well, not just emotional and physical and all the others, but what I will do is that we will bring their spirituality, their faith into the sessions. We will use it as coping skills. We will listen to worship music. We will talk about the importance of prayer to help them manage anxiety or whatever it is that they're experiencing. So it does play a role in therapy. And then my friend Ivan, he told me that we should encourage pastors and faith leaders to not shy away from preaching about mental health. As faith leaders, consider going to therapy yourself as a way to embody what is preached on. He also said that it's important to recognize the limits on pastoral counseling in comparison to clinical counseling, and that sometimes good intentions from faith leaders can cause harm to the person reaching for help. So I don't know a lot about pastoral counseling, but what I was informed is that pastoral counselors, unless they have like a clinical program like masters in family therapy, masters in social work, or masters in mental health counseling, they're not really qualified to diagnose or treat mental health concerns. And so this is, again, two different wings on the same bird, right? There's different roles. And so just like I will send clients to go consult with their pastors, with their faith leaders for spiritual situations, the other way around too, sending them to a trusted therapist that can help. So my hope, because I'm passionate about trauma, is that we have a trauma-informed society. So we think about trauma-informed care. Trauma-informed care is, again, the idea that we assume that every person has had a history of some sort of trauma. Trauma-informed care looks like having invitational language, giving people the choices on what to do, right? If I'm in a session with a client, we're no longer seeing clients face to face, we're doing over Zoom. But if I'm in an office with a client and I'm gonna get up to maybe get a box of tissues or something, a trauma-informed therapist will say, I'm gonna get up to go grab that box of tissues. That gives the person an idea on what to expect, and it doesn't create this sense of panic seeing the therapist just get up out of nowhere. So invitational language and just language where you're saying what you're doing is really important for trauma-informed care. So when we think about individuals with mental illness, oftentimes our society has taught us to think in terms of what is wrong with this person. That actually is a judgment, right? So instead of asking what is wrong with this person, a trauma-informed perspective is what has happened to this person. When a child or a teenager or an adult is reacting aggressively, instead of asking what's wrong with him or what's wrong with her, she's so disruptive, all these things, right? She's so malcriada, all of these things that we come up with, asking what has happened to this person. That's compassionate, that's with a lot of empathy. So my hope is that trauma-informed environments will include schools, universities, mental health settings, places of worship, organizations, parenting, that it can hopefully have an impact on our entire society. So I go back to the quote that pain travels through families until someone is ready to feel it. Pain also travels through society until someone is ready to feel it. And what I have seen in the Latino community is that a lot of the younger generation, they're more open to therapy. And what they're doing is that they're healing generational trauma, generational mental illnesses by them themselves engaging in therapy. And they're also creating a different future for the generations that will come after them. Okay, so this is the end of my presentation, and these are just some questions that I want to leave you all with. What are some stigmas related to mental health that you may have? We all have them. Let's be honest. Now that I'm a therapist, I don't have them, but I used to have them, right? How does culture influence and impact your perspective on mental health topics such as trauma, depression, or anxiety? How can you be part of a solution to facilitate greater access, lower the stigma on mental health in the Latinx community, and encourage the use of resources? And how can you walk alongside the Latinx members of your place of worship to ensure their healing as it relates to their mental health? So those are just questions to reflect on and see what comes up for you. And then here I just have some resources. The first are national resources. So the National Suicide Hotline, Crisis Text Line, and National Domestic Violence Hotline. And then the others are local to North Carolina. And that's that.
Thank you, Alvely. We'll go ahead and have, I guess, a time of Q&A. I can send these resources actually to all the attendees. I'll send it to your email so that you'll have it, especially those that are here in North Carolina. Those are very helpful to have just for that. Yeah, so we can go ahead and do the Q&A. I don't know if you want to put up the questions up on the screen, or how do you want to do it?
Yeah, I can do that. And also, if anyone just has any general questions, feel free to ask.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Can you all see that? Now you can, right? Yeah. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. Let me actually, here we go.
Yeah, if you want to share something, you can just raise your hand. I'll go ahead and let me know. Karen?
Sí, yes. Well, like, thank you for all the information. It was great information that you gave us. Good to know. In my case, I have this problem at home, and it very helped me a lot, all the information that you have gave. But this, like you said, the system is oversaturated, that it's hard to get help. Mm-hmm. And sometimes with the question that you said, just think about what is the barriers that people have. And I have seen, like, my age people, we hide it really good, or we try to hide it really good. Mm-hmm. But like our kids, they can't. And that's where we can see this more and more. Mm-hmm. And some of the questions that I was thinking, because I have heard it from my house, it's like, why do I have to tell them my life? It's like they will not trust anybody because the same trauma or whatever's happening, anxiety, they lock themselves, like they don't want to look for help. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things, or how they can help me, or they can't do nothing for me, or I don't trust anybody. Mm-hmm. Like I said, I've been through all this, and it's like, my question is how we can support them, to help them to try to understand that they need that help, that they need to seek for that help and try at least.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing part of your own story. I think it requires courage to share these things. And that's one of the first things I tell people when they come to my office is, you being here requires so much courage and so much strength. And so thank you for sharing that. I think that what you described is the cultural stigma, right? It has been ingrained in our culture, and it has been passed down for so many generations, that there's this idea that why am I going to tell this person what I'm going through? One of the things that I've heard specifically from teenagers is, why do you care about what I've gone through? And so that's usually a reflection of, this person is feeling like no one has cared before. And so why is this stranger going to care? And so I think that what is important is to start with deconstructing or taking apart these beliefs that are harmful. This idea that if you go see a therapist, it's because you're crazy, right? That's not true. And so what I like to shift it with people is, when you come to see a therapist, you're doing so much work, and it requires so much courage to sit with a stranger and to put it on the table, to say, these are the things that have hurt me, right? What I also tell people is that by the time they get to a therapist's office, they are carrying so much. One of the examples I give all of my clients is that we're carrying una mochila, like, right? We have this backpack. We're carrying this backpack, and in this backpack, it's an invisible backpack, and we are filling it with rocks, small rocks, big rocks, medium rocks that represent different experiences, different events in our lives. And by the time we get to therapy, we can no longer hold it. It's been weighing us down. So it is, the work starts with unpacking that, like the cultural stigma on what does it mean to go to therapy. And also maybe having the conversations with them, like saying, hey, it's okay to see a therapist. This is the way that they can help you. What I offer people is I tell them, okay, you're here, let's try 2 or 3 sessions. If it's not for you, then you don't have to come back. And usually they keep coming back because they like it. But thank you for that question. It starts at home with unpacking the cultural belief, and also in our society, and also in churches, like having these conversations, being able to preach about mental health.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We invite anyone else that may feel comfortable in sharing. Of course, there's always a choice. You don't have to, you don't feel comfortable doing so. We just want to give the time in case someone does.
Yes, hi. I am part of a bereavement ministry in the Catholic Church. And one of the challenges that we have, and I believe that you probably mentioned it, is misconceptions of religious beliefs. Sometimes I think that our main challenge in being part of this ministry is to learn how to be listeners.
Mm-hmm.
We're being trained for that as part of also a spiritual formation program, because as faith leaders, sometimes we just want to offer what we think is a consolation, and at the same time we're dismissing the process of the stages of mourning.
Mm-hmm.
We might say, oh, don't worry, she is going to heaven.
Mm-hmm.
She's better in the other world.
Mm-hmm.
And or, oh my God, you're still suffering, you're still thinking about that. And
Mm-hmm.
we are passing judgment, and we're thinking that we are saying something beneficial, and it turned out that I'm learning that people have to go through the process of mourning, whatever it is. It could be death, or it could be losing a job, or a marriage situation. Is that we have to learn how to be better listeners. And it reminds me of the book of Job, that the friends were doing a good job when they sat with Job for 7 days and 7 nights in the silence, and they listened to him. But there were theologians, and when they tried to offer their perspective of whether Job's sufferings was some punishment from God, then they mess it up. So with this, I'm just trying to see the importance of faith leaders to become aware of these techniques. And I think that in our case, spiritual formation in a way that focuses on accompanying spiritually our congregants in whatever situation they're dealing with is actually a must. Is important so we can benefit from psychology and also from faith, for all the tools that you guys can bring up to make both of this science and faith work together. So thank you for the information. I learned a lot with you today.
Thank you for that. I think, thank you for giving me that, the story of Job and how they sat with him. I've never thought of that. And I can use that with my clients as well. Yeah, listening is hard because when we listen to someone else's pain, we often feel uncomfortable, or it just feels like too much to hold. And so we want to quickly offer something to try to make them feel better. But the reality is that if most of the time it does not. In grief and the loss is so complicated. There's so many different ways of grieving. There's no like wrong way of grieving. And we are a society that tends to want to just say, oh, this person is in a better place. This person's no longer in pain. But what I have heard from people is that that's harmful for them. That's invalidating their experience. It's making them feel that they should be over it. So yeah, just being good listeners. I think part of what needs to happen for us to become good listeners is that we have to be okay with sitting with being uncomfortable in someone else's pain, right? And so part of that is being able to take deep breaths as the person is sharing, being able to just hold that space for them, because it is healing. That will be more healing than any words you can say. And that looks like saying, I'm here with you, I'm here listening. Because that's another question people usually ask, well, what does that look like? And so what I will say is just sit with them and just say, I'm here with you. That sounds really hard. I cannot imagine what that's like. And just sitting with them.
Yeah, it's actually what you said, to be present.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to say just one quick question more. I know it's already 7. Feel free, if you have to step out. I just wanted to make sure we touch on this question. Jose Diaz Mata is joining us from Peru, which he wrote in the chat from the province of Ica in Peru, and he's saying that there is a lot of things happening in Peru right now and in his city because of COVID. And he's saying there's very little attention that the government and people are paying very little attention to the actual psychological consequences of this, right, of COVID and what is happening now with people. So his question is, how can we begin to even think of a plan or developing a plan to create more conscience, right, about the need for this? When we see that in his case, in his city, even professionals are not prepared to just deal with the amount of, right, that COVID has brought, the amount of need. Why would you think it's something?
Right. I can respond in Spanish if that's helpful, and then I'll also say it in English.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure. I think he's in the Spanish channel, so if you do it in English, translate it.
Okay. So, what I think about this is that there's also a lot of healing that can occur collectively. So the first thing that I thought about with his question of how can we start a plan to bring awareness to this is maybe do some group work. If this is related to like mental health and how COVID is impacting people's mental health, having support groups. There's a lot of research that shows, especially in the Latino community, because it's such a collective culture, that a lot of healing happens collectively. We've run a few groups at El Futuro, and a lot of healing happens out of that, more so than individual sessions. So being able to create a support group where people can come, maybe the first time might be like 1 or 2 people And I'm thinking, wait, it's COVID time. We can't have people together. So that's another barrier, right? But maybe if people can create some sort of, if they have access to technology, some sort of group virtually where they just sit down and normalize the issues going on with COVID, and that they have that supportive circle, even if it's just virtually, even if it's outside 6 feet distance with each other, and wearing your mask if that's possible, so that people can start seeing I'm not the only one that's going through this. Because oftentimes people think they are the only one. So also having conversations about what mental health is and the importance of it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alvely, for that. And I'm sure, this has been recorded, so I'll be sending this video as well to all the participants. And if you're okay with it, I can also send the slides.
I'll send it to you.
Okay with that? Yeah, I can send that to everybody. I know it's a little past 7, so it's past our time. Thank you so much, Alvely, for this rich presentation. I've learned so much, and you've clarified so many things that I've seen, and given language to so many things that I've seen in the Latino community. So thank you. We're so glad to have had you. You all remember that we'll continue this conversation next month with a panel with local pastors and Alvely herself as well, to just talk about how do we, all this information, how does it work in the local church context, and what do we do with it? So we hope you can join us then. I'll send you more information about it on your email. But thank you all so much for being here. And yeah, we hope to see you in August.
Thank you all for having me.
Alvely. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
We'll see you all. Bye.
Bye.
Gracias, Alvely.
De nada. Espero que le pueda ayudar mucho.
Eres una muchacha muy preparada. Me siento muy orgullosa de ti. Gracias.
Gracias.
Gracias, gracias.
Okay, let me, bye.
Bye.